Okay, hope everyone had a good lunch and you're ready to begin working again this afternoon. I have an announcement to begin with. For those of you that have been at previous conferences, you know that OCEPP has a student essay competition. Fortunately, this year's winners, Sajay Singh from Western University and Connor Smith from University of Toronto, were not able to attend. Sajay's essay focused on renewed investment in nuclear power, while Connor wrote about some of the recommendations submitted to the Elliot Lake Inquiry, both topics of today's session, interesting enough. Both papers can be found on the OCEPP website. Please join me in a round of applause for the record for Sajay and Connor. We are being recorded, so I literally meant for the record. It began as a typical summer day nearly 2 years ago, some 550 kilometers northwest of Toronto. The city of Elliot Lake, at one time the world's leading producer of uranium, had been working hard to rebuild the economy and attract new businesses, families, retiring baby boomers, and outdoor enthusiasts. This community of 11,500 discovered at mid-afternoon that day, a focal point of its economy and community life lay in ruins. At the Algo Centre Mall, a section of the upper-level parking area crashed down on unsuspecting shoppers and employees, killing 2 women and injuring 23 others. Within a few weeks, the Ontario government established the Elliot Lake Commission of Inquiry, headed by the Honourable Paul Belanger. The inquiry was tasked to examine the events that led up to the roof failure. Chris Roney is our next speaker. He's well-versed in structural engineering matters and the Elliot Lake Inquiry. Chris is a practicing structural engineer and president of Roney Engineering, a Kingston consulting firm that specializes in structural engineering services related to building design, construction, investigations, and restorations. He's also a third-generation engineer, accredited building design specialist and consulting engineer, and an active contributor to his profession. During his more than 11 years as a member of the Council of PEO, he has served on a number of committees and task forces, including the Elliot Lake Advisory Committee. In November of 2013, he represented PEO at the roundtable that held by the inquiry into the collapse of the mall. As well, Chris is a director of the Board of Engineers Canada and a member of the Ontario Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing Building Advisory Council. He chaired the Part 4 Structural Technical Advisory Committee for the Ontario Building Code 2012. He holds a degree in civil engineering from Queen's University. Please join me in welcoming Chris to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, for that kind introduction. You did steal a few of my introductory comments about the Algo Lake collapse, though, but so you may hear a little bit of repetition. Everybody good? Have a good lunch? Everybody's happy? I like to talk to happy people instead of grumpy people. It reminds me too much of PEO Council. And yeah, the people, yeah. I hear you, Johnny. You know what I'm talking about. Okay, tough act to follow. The morning sessions, though, I found very, very, very interesting. When Catherine and Bernie approached me about maybe doing this this morning, they asked me to explain and go through a little bit of, you know, the events at Elliot Lake and the Elliot Lake Inquiry and what transpired, you know. And at last count, there were some 9,900 exhibits. There were 40,000 pages of transcripts, and there were 8 months of hearings. So I said, well, okay, I can do that. And then they said, you got about 10, 15 minutes. Can you get through that? Well, so I'm going to be talking really fast. Are you ready? And because this session is intended to be a bit of an open forum, obviously I'm not going to get through everything unless nobody gets up to speak, and then you'll hear the rest of my presentation. But as it is, I'm going to take you through what I can, and then maybe we'll have a good time for some discussions about this. So, as Bernie pointed out, after years of leakage, years of investigations, countless patches, on June 23rd of 2012 at about 2:18 p.m., the Algo Centre Mall collapsed. What happened was there was a connection of just one steel beam to its supporting column suddenly failed, and 2 bays of the rooftop parking structure on the mall collapsed down into the mall in the vicinity of the lottery kiosk. 2 people were killed, Lucy Alwyn and Dolores Perizzolo. They were both in the vicinity of the lottery kiosk when it came down. The collapse was very, very sudden, and it took in all about 1 second for this to happen. It happened on a sunny day with only very minimal load on that slab. Now, the history of the Algo Mall, it was constructed back in 1979, and at that time it was described as a crowning achievement for the municipality of Elliot Lake. The mall consists of, it's about 512 feet, 374 feet long, an L-shaped configuration. It's primarily 2 levels, though it reduces down to 1 at the west end, and it goes up to 3 levels in the east. And the hotel section rises about 4 levels above the parking deck. The roof of the mall serves as a parking deck for the facility. Now, the structure itself consists of a structural steel frame that supports these 8-inch thick hollow core precast concrete slabs. These slabs are about 4 feet wide, about 30 feet long. The slabs sit on those steel beams. And the steel beams, they connect into steel columns. At each of these slabs that are just precast and set down, there are joints over the steel beams. The slabs are then topped with a concrete topping over the whole thing. And this is a little excerpt from the original architectural drawings. I know it's pretty poor quality, but that's the best I had to work with. The architectural drawings call for, over this parking deck on the top of the mall, it forms the roof of the mall, remember, called for a waterproofing sealer. There was no specification or requirement for a waterproofing membrane. And the evidence from the inquiry suggests that not even that sealer was ultimately applied. So it was really nothing on the roof at all. You may have heard that there was a lot of talk at the inquiry and in the media and such, a lot of controversy about whose dumb idea was it to park cars on top of a roof of a structure. I don't think that's really the issue. It's not that dumb an idea. The real flaws were in that when you do that, and I mean, you wouldn't think of doing a roof without a waterproofing membrane, and just because when you put cars on it, it just makes it that much more important to protect and ensure that the water and the salty water can't get through. But the roof began to leak very, very shortly after construction, as you can imagine, because in effect there was no waterproofing. The locals would describe the mall as having more buckets than benches, and they weren't kidding. You can see there are green hoses that dangle from the ceiling from plastic tarps that collect literally gallons of waters. The locals would refer to those as diapers on the ceiling. And over the life of the building, there were many engineering investigations, there were many reports generated, and there were various Band-Aid solutions. And of all these engineering investigations and reports, it was a who's who of engineering firms, very well-respected firms that had been there over the years. And that kind of explains why, as the engineering profession, we started to see some headlines like, how could so many engineers be so wrong? That was in Maclean's magazine, or in the National Post, about a failure of the engineering profession in Ontario. Now, just to take you through some of the engineering reports and the kinds of findings and the information that was provided, I'll take you through a few of them. As far back as 1998, there was a report carried out that looked at the leakage problem and looked at the structure. And they concluded at that time that there was no evidence of structural distress or excessive deterioration. One of the problems with the report that was pointed out during the course of the inquiry was, first of all, it wasn't clear at all from that report as to what extent that they looked, where they inspected the structure. Now remember, the lay public is relying on engineers and engineering reports. They don't know anything about whether the structure is good or bad. They don't know necessarily what is a sufficient level of sampling to be able to then make a determination as to the safety of the structure. The report at that time recommended that further studies be carried out to accurately assess the extent of the corrosion. And they also recommended that a membrane be installed, which seems to make a lot of sense. That recommendation wasn't acted on, unfortunately. But the first one where further studies be carried out was. And the same firm came back in 1999. Now, this time they did a slightly more thorough structural condition assessment. and they reported on the corrosion that they found that was associated with the leak locations. And they say at that time that the corrosion products they measured were about 3 millimeters of rust building up on some of these steel beams. But they said there was no severe scaling observed. And they maintained in the report, 3 to 5 millimeters of corrosion product is less than 1 millimeter loss of actual cross-sectional area of the beams. Again, one of the flaws that was pointed out during the scope of the inquiry was that they weren't clear to the extent of the investigation. How much did they look at? Did they look at any of the connections? That wasn't clear. The building department did get involved at one point for the city of Elliot Lake because, again, there was ongoing reports. Everybody knew that there was a problem there. And they had written a report in 2009 talking about a number of the areas of the water leakage and the fireproofing, because they used a spray-on fireproof, just sprays on the underside of the steel beams and such. And that was starting to come off because of all the water leakage and such. So at that point, they had asked for a report to be carried out by an engineer to comment on the missing fireproofing and the rust that was clearly evident on the structural steel. Now, so a report was commissioned by the current owners of the mall in 2009. And it's important, I've skipped over a few reports because there are lots of other reports out there that, again, talked about rust, talked about some issues, but again, said it wasn't enough of a concern at this point. For instance, in 2005, there was a report for a prospective mortgage lender, and that report concluded generally good condition, repairs to the roof framing not currently required. But by 2009, the next report came along, and this one was specifically to address the issues of the missing fireproofing and the rust on the structural steel. At least this time they said they looked at 5 places. They did a visual examination. And interestingly and ominously enough, one of the locations they looked at was the beam right over the ticket kiosk, the one that ultimately failed. And there are photographs of that very beam in their report you'll find. But again, their findings were that there were no structural concerns that they observed in 2009. They did another report in 2012. This report, the inspection was carried out on April 12th of 2013. They issued the report on May 3rd. So their investigation was about 10 weeks before the ultimate failure. In the inquiry evidence, the inquiry heard that apparently when the first draft of the report, when the owners saw it, they didn't like what they saw. There were a few things in there that they thought would be too critical, and that they asked the engineer to take them out and remove them, and he did. This was a structural inspection, and in this, the engineer reported that there was evidence of corrosion where the deck was leaking, but there was little loss of cross-sectional area, and the structure was still structurally sound. There were no visual signs of structural distress. It's not a very long report. I didn't do the second page, but the second page basically just has the signature. So a very, very brief and concise report that we know that this was ultimately horribly flawed. As an aside, the individual that prepared this report was an individual who was an engineer, but his license was under suspension at the time that this report was written over another matter. And so, though he did the work, and he did the investigation, and he liaised with the client, and he wrote the report, and altered the report then at the owner's request, he couldn't actually stamp the report or take responsibility for it. And so he had his colleague, another engineer in the office, review the report and sign it. The other engineer, incidentally, was a mining engineer. After the collapse, after the collapse and the investigation, the Ontario Provincial Police actually commissioned NOR to carry out a forensic investigation of the incidents. So they investigated the circumstances of the collapse. They went through and reviewed the original drawings, the past reports that were made available, and they determined the cause. And quickly, their conclusions were basically that the original design, now this was done, of course, back in 1979, so it would have been the 1975 version of the code. And it doesn't match the codes we have today in terms of what we do with protection of parking garages and so on. And so the original design actually conformed to the codes of the day and actually did reflect what was common practice. Hence the reason that so many older parking garages are in extreme distress today. The design and the detailing of the rooftop parking, it did have, in their opinion, major deficiencies. And again, the main one was that no waterproofing membrane or even that sealer was ever applied. So, and they concluded also that the major leakages had really been throughout the 33-year life of the building, and that all the attempts, and there were attempts made to fix the leakage before, they were all very localized attempts, and they were all totally ineffective in what they were doing. It had been recommended to the owner on a number of occasions that the proper thing to do was to install the waterproofing membrane. But you can imagine the installation of a waterproofing membrane now on this parking deck would be very, very expensive and very disruptive to the operations of the mall. And so with that huge cost involved, the owners naturally and consistently always just went to Band-Aid type solutions. So NOR also concluded from their post-collapse investigation where they went through and had a look. Remember, they were looking just some 10 weeks or maybe a little bit more at this point after the last inspection. And what they found was very different than what had been reported. They said what they found was extensive corrosion, and that extensive corrosion was widespread. It ranged typically from severe to very severe. They did it two different ways too. I mean, first of all, they sent one team out, just do a visual review, like what we, most normal engineering firms would be retained to do a normal review. Then just visually. Then also they went through and did a much more thorough, detailed one where they're taking samples and analyzing them and so on, something that's probably above the standard that you would normally expect, just as a comparison. But both the visual review they deemed would have been or should have been sufficient to identify and set off some alarm bells with this structure. The previous structural evaluations, they all reported the corrosion as having a negligible impact on the structure. None commented on the connections. And remember, it was the connection that ultimately gave way. And they were very critical that of the previous inspections, none were very specific about what they looked at and what they didn't look at, and what the implications may be for someone reading the report to draw from that. At the time of the last report, they said failure would have been imminent. And it's easy to say that because indeed it did fail. But they also say they have no reason to believe that last engineer would have actually seen, though he looked at the beam in question, he may not have seen the connection because things were covered with finishes, with fireproofing, and that sort of thing. So the failure, as I've mentioned, it occurred at the connection, and that's the actual beam, the end of the beam that failed. That connection of the beam to the supporting column, it was sudden and abrupt. Loads at the time of the failure were relatively small, so it wasn't a load-related issue. The failure was 100% the result of corrosion. The loads at the time were actually only about 1/5 of the design loads. So the inquiry, the Elliot Lake Inquiry's mandate, it was established, first of all, July 12th, 2012. The mandate was to inquire into and report on the events surrounding the collapse, the deaths and the injuries. Also a component on the emergency management and response. There was a lot of criticism about that as well. It was led by Commissioner Mr. Justice Paul Belanger, and the hearings began on March 4th, 2013, and they concluded in October and were followed by some roundtable sessions in November. Now, PEO's role, and I'm speaking really from PEO's involvement. So there were a lot of issues that were raised at the inquiry. There were a lot of matters discussed that relate to a lot of different things. And the part that we focused on, and the focus I'm going to be talking about now, is the impact on the regulation of engineering and such. There are a lot of technical issues and things like that. That really wasn't PEO's role in this inquiry. So by PEO being involved, that gave us we requested and were granted standing, and that allowed us to participate in the hearings, we could question witnesses, and we could also provide written submissions. This provided PEO an important opportunity, and as well a responsibility, we felt, to participate in examining professional engineering legislation and policies and guidelines. We'd also provide evidence, as the Commission was requesting, concerning the professional engineers that were involved with the mall, and provide evidence concerning the regulation of professional engineering and of engineers and engineering in Ontario. The most important part, in my mind, was it allowed us to make written and oral submissions to the inquiry. This is a policy conference we're at today, and unfortunately, what we find is it's sometimes easier to move things forward in terms of changing policy when there's a motivation from the public, from the government, to do so. And so this, tragic as it is somewhat of an opportunity for us to finally make some change. Because though PEO regulates the practice of professional engineering and has some regulation-making authority, we can't do anything without the concurrence of government. And this we view it as maybe an opportunity to finally be able to make some positive and important change to the regulation of engineering in Ontario. As I pointed out, it's not PEO's role, and I'm not really going to get into talking to you today about how salt penetrates and causes corrosion and the technical aspects, though as a structural engineer I have a hard time not talking about that. But it was certainly not PEO's role to provide any kind of engineering evidence or any opinions on technical matters. And I also have to be a little bit careful because as PEO, and I'm on PEO council and involved, that I'm certainly not going to get into discussions of judging the conduct of the particular engineers that were involved, because there are investigations that are going on and I can't jeopardize those. The themes that came out of the inquiry that were particularly relevant, I mean, we had 8 months of testimony, but themes started to emerge that were particularly relevant, that affect how we regulate the practice of professional engineering. And I'm just going to deal with those. Now, one of them is transparency. The engineer, that wrote that last fateful report, had lost his license, as I mentioned to you some time ago. And in fact, the other engineer that ultimately had his license and then did stamp the report, he too had been previously disciplined, though his suspension was up. The original structural engineer that designed the mall in the first place was also had his license revoked. And this information, when it came out at the inquiry, surprised everybody as they learned this. None of the people in Elliot Lake, and the building officials, the mall owners, and all the various parties, they all said, well, we didn't know any of this. If we'd known, maybe we would have done things different. So an issue was raised on the matter of transparency. How should that information be available to the public, and how would we make it available? There were suggestions like, when an engineer is disciplined, should PEO be sending out a mass mailing to all building officials, or should the engineer inform all their clients? What about past clients? What about future clients? And so that was a question that we had to consider at PEO as to how best to deliver that. Another issue was standards and guidelines. These are existing buildings. We're assessing the structural capacity, the safety of an existing building. We have lots of regulation that deals with the standards and the requirements if you're designing and constructing a new building. But there really isn't anything out there to deal with all the buildings that are out there now. The scope of the investigations, when an investigation is done, because the report's commissioned, but what guides what the scope and how far that investigation should go, what is a reasonable sampling, what do you do if you want me to tell you if this structure is safe that we're in right now and I can't see any of the structure. And so what happens, scope of the investigations are really a matter that's always left between the client, might be the owner of the facility, and the individual engineer. And so scope is dictated by clients, by budget. The presence of finishings, as I said, or fireproofing may limit the scope of what you can do. And that's a fact, that's a reality. But none of the reports I saw spoke about the limitations. So the layperson reading and relying on the report is wasn't really even aware. All they saw was that line at the end saying the structure is still fine. And so the other thing that we heard is that pressure, in this particular case, by the client to alter the report. Don't make it sound as bad or whatever. PEO did, after the collapse and before the inquiry really got going, issued a professional practice bulletin to try to provide some guidance to engineers, because the inquiry heard that there was really no guidance out there. There were no really good best practices. You could draw a little bit from bridge inspections and things like that, but average practitioners did not have a lot of standards to guide them on what they should be doing until this came along. And PEO's professional practice bulletin was mentioned many times at the inquiry, and it was held in high regard. It would say, this is the first time in this that we actually have something that is very relevant and is of great use. The other issue that came up is the availability of past reports. I mentioned to you that we had numerous past reports, but each of the firms that came along to do an investigation, to report and come up with recommendations, was doing so in isolation. Not only that, the municipality also didn't know necessarily about things in past reports that had been gone on in the past. And several witnesses testified that if they had had access to some of the previous investigations, if they'd known what had been looked at and what hadn't, that sort of thing, it may very well have changed their approach. Remember, this inquiry is all about bad things happened. How do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Is there something we can do differently? Another theme that came out of the inquiry is the issue of competency certification and continuing education. During the inquiry heard from their experts, from the NOR group and others, that assessing an existing structure, because every existing structure, it starts to deteriorate the day after you leave the site. At what point and how do you assess and make the necessary judgments? First of all, when it's bad enough that it's becoming a safety concern, or the judgment about what are the key and critical components. I obviously can't see everything in this building if you ask me to do a report on this building. How do you decide what are the most important things to look at? That requires a lot of engineering judgment. It requires a high level of expertise and experience. But right now, there's no constraints in legislation about the areas in which, first of all, a licensee may practice. It's all your own judgment as to how competent you think you are, or how important it is for you to take on another contract if the money's right. There's no specialty-specific certification. If this work, as the inquiry heard, is fairly specialized and it's so safety critical, but how does the public know who has the qualifications to do it and who doesn't? There are lots of people who are engineers out there, and lots of people who are structural engineers even out there. But not everybody necessarily has the expertise, and the public has no way to know whether they do or they don't. And we have no requirement at the present time for mandatory continuing education or anything like that. Once you've got your license, once you've been licensed, you've had to go through a process that show you have the necessary training and experience to get that. But after that, there really isn't anything. The other theme that came out was the issue of an individual practicing engineering while their license is suspended. There's nothing that prevents this. What the important thing is, they do need to have another licensed professional engineer supervise and take responsibility for their work. But the inquiry had some problems with this, in that does this really satisfy the intention of a suspension? This particular engineer involved didn't really miss a beat, just kept on doing what he'd always been doing. And clients didn't know, and when he needed that a seal on it, it was easy enough to get that from his partner. This isn't allowed in a lot of other professions, like architecture, for instance. If you read their requirements, and this was a new one on me when we got into this, they're not even allowed really to employ or associate with an architect who's had their license suspended or revoked. Quite different in professional engineering. So I've used up certainly my time at this point, and so I'm going to stop now. PEO was tasked with putting together a submission, and we came up with 11 recommendations dealing with all these different themes. The recommendations we came up with, we feel pretty good about, in that they're very pragmatic, they're very achievable, and they would deal with a lot of these issues. Some we've been able to actually act on already. For instance, our information that you can find out about practitioners' discipline history on the website or their license status has already been improved. Most of the changes, though, are changes that require creating standards that have legislative authority to be enforced. And for that, we can't do it without the concurrence of government. We're still waiting for the results, the Elliot Lake Inquiry final report. That's not coming until October 14th of this year, hopefully, although the complaint against, one engineer has been charged criminally and is trying to block, have it redacted until pending the outcome of his criminal proceedings. But we are optimistic because our recommendations were extremely well received by the Commissioner. Our participation at the roundtable went very well as we presented and discussed our recommendations. And so we're very optimistic that through this tragedy there will be that motivation of government to actually put through some of these changes I think are going to improve engineering regulation in the interest of the public in Ontario. So with that, I won't take you through the recommendations. Love to if you want to sit around, I'll keep going. But I think it's time to open it up and maybe entertain some discussion and some conversation now. Okay?
I'm just going to join Chris up here because in my other role as the person in charge of PEO's professional standards work, there's a lot of these things coming out of the inquiry that are going to blend into guidelines, standards, things that we do that go beyond the specific aspects of structural engineering. For instance, Chris brought up the problem of scope of investigations. I mean, that's a problem that we have throughout the engineering profession, and the kind of things that we will develop because of Elliot Lake will have impacts on other engineers of many different categories. If we try to say how investigations should be structured, or all kinds of studies by engineers, what are the impacts of that? What are the impacts on engineers' responsibilities, liabilities, duty to report issues? During the course of the many reports that came out, it was often raised of whether engineers who were looking at one aspect, for instance, if you happen to see that there's water running down the walls and you went for an investigation of the roof leakage, well, what about the effect on the electrical system in the building? And nobody reported on that. I mean, people could have been electrocuted with water pouring down the walls, running through electrical panels. So what's the obligation on engineers to report the kind of side effects of all these things? So we can see that that the issues that arise out of Elliot Lake are going to have, if we look at them in detail, we're going to have impacts that go on and on and on throughout the entire profession. So I'm here in case anything comes up that has to deal with those kind of things. But
what he's trying to say is he's here to take the tough questions?
No, I'm going to be, or Johnny and myself are going to be ultimately in charge of running these things through government and through the members, and getting the flack from the members when we try to put in standards that nobody wants to live with.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Bernie. You kind of stole most of my question.
Okay.
It was really addressing, I'm Ken Klopp, I'm from the RCMP in a non-policing role. I do a lot of work in advising on security and safety for national infrastructure. I've been watching this for quite a while, and as an engineer, kind of concerned about some of those very implications that you're talking about. You know, how do we go in and whether or not you can or should be allowing your client to limit the scope of your investigation. You should be following it, in my mind, to any potential safety violation that you see. perhaps you have to at some point come back and say, okay, I have a line of inquiry that I have to pursue. Can I do it? If I can't, perhaps I can't issue a complete and signed and report. You know, you shouldn't be indicating or even leaving the impression that you have a complete report if you don't have a complete report. I think some of this is already covered well by professional ethics, and it's a question of getting perhaps better guidance to the application of it. It certainly raises a question specifically to me when I look at the question of the waterproofing membrane. If I understand right, there was an experimental type membrane that was supposed to have been put on. It had been endorsed by another engineer or a firm or whatever as being sufficient that you didn't have to do the underlay. But obviously this brings into question then sort of who's the judge of that effectiveness. It's becomes sort of a cross between the architectural concern, the architectural responsibility, the speccing of that particular one versus the engineering consequences of the leaks that were a result of it. And I won't speculate on how that's going to work out, but it certainly is, I guess, the question. So it's more of a comment than a question, but if you have anything to further to address on on that issue, I'd like to hear it.
Yeah. Well, I think that, you know, and thank you for that question. One of the important issues is you're assessing existing building. You're never going to be able to, and I made that point, you're never going to be able to see everything. It is, and it's well accepted in scientific circles and engineering circles that assessments and judgments are based on the information you have available to you. It may be a random sampling of a number of locations, and so you have to make sure that is that a reasonable number of locations, that sort of thing. And you're going to draw a conclusion from that. But the important thing is you have to make it very clear to the people that are relying on it, that may be lay people, the limitations of what that actually means. I've seen in my time, 16 years now on the complaints committee at PEO, so many engineers get into trouble because their reports didn't outline what the limitation and the scope was. It's totally understandable for their limitations. But you've got to make sure that nobody reads more into your report when safety is concerned than it's really there. So the blanket statements that I flashed up there about, you know, that last report, or the second last report, it was in a response to an order from the chief building official, and the chief building official ordered the owner to get a report of the entire mall to ensure that it is structurally sound. The engineer, obviously, he only looked at the areas because he was directed by the client. He testified, he was directed by the client and said, look at where it's leaking and give me a report on that. Okay, the client's paying the bills, I'm not doing this for free, but the report needs to be very clear that I only looked at the areas where it was leaking and that I can't comment any further. Those areas I looked at, my opinion is it's not bad enough that the structure is in danger, but it's only those areas I looked at, and I can't give you an opinion as to whether there's a problem somewhere else that I can't see, so that no one is misled, because that's exactly what happened. And you're an owner, you don't want to. I mean, this is a huge cost, and I mean and I've been in the position before as a structural engineer where I had to say, you know, I'm sorry, this building is not safe, and I you know, people shouldn't be in it, and it might be a fully occupied building, and the consequences are huge financially. There's huge pressure on you not to do that. So it's a difficult situation. If we can, you know, assist the public and assist the engineers in trying to outline what the rules are, it's a benefit to everybody, I think.
Mm-hmm. I would just add that you can't get an open-ended contract, no matter how much all engineers would love that. And you're going to have to do the limitations of the report's going to have to specify the limitations, but then there's the issue of what is the duty of the engineer to point out to the client, this is where maybe we have to go further. And then is it enough just to make the recommendations to the client if the engineer knows that there's safety issues? And that's where we need to have the discussions with other levels of government for other regulation to say, when can an engineer demand that certain kind of, if the client only gives you an inspection just to look at some mold on the wall, but you trace that, you know that's caused by water leakage, maybe the engineer has to report that there should be a a leak somewhere and that some other kind of investigation should be carried out. But if the owner doesn't want to do that, just is worried about the mold, then what can the engineer do? And that's where we got to look at bigger public policy concerns about the kind of regulations and empowerment of engineers that might be involved, or other avenues to deal with concerns raised by engineers. And I think that's the next steps that we have to take after this. Vic?
Wondering if you could address the issue of what we train our engineers in terms of the safety and risk management side of things, what we've done in the past, and what do you think we might want to do in the future? And I'm opening up the whole dialogue of maybe some of us that graduated 30 years ago didn't have as much on the safety risk management side as perhaps we should have today. One of the things that an organization I'm working with, and it was detailed by Michael Mastromattio, is through Minerva Canada. We're trying to put in engineering modules in managing occupational health and safety issues. Safety and risk management is a 3-hour module in there. Maybe it's not enough. Maybe there should be other ways of getting to the practicing engineers as well. This whole area of safety is paramount to our profession. There has to be a way of, in addition to the contract you might have with someone for a specific job, if there is some issue, shouldn't there be an onus on an engineer to report to an appropriate authority, whether it's the municipal office in Elliot Lake or the Ministry of Labor or somewhere else, or to the PEO, some area that was uncovered that could potentially be a major public hazard. So one, if you could address the education side of things on the safety and risk management side, and secondly, is there something more that we need to do to put an onus on our profession to make sure that these things don't get lost in a purely contractual arrangement with a client?
I'm not sure I can give you a great answer on the educational aspects, and I'm not sure if, Bernie, you can either.
I don't know if any curriculum has health and safety.
One of the difficulties that comes up quite often is, well, what is safe? So the term, you know, this structure or whatever must be safe. Nothing is entirely safe. It's all done based on statistics, probabilities, cost benefit, you know, analysis. We don't design a building to withstand any load that could ever be imposed because the cost outweighs the benefit. And so the issue of, you know, when is something safe enough? Like I said when I was talking there that, you know, you design a structure such as the Algo Mall, and you design it to the standards in terms of sizing your beams, for instance, in your original design, based on the loads that are given to you and appropriate standards. And into those standards are built in those levels of safety that in the infinite wisdom of those writing the codes and standards, they've deemed that provides an acceptable level of performance. It doesn't mean that it would withstand any load, obviously. Okay, so we meet that standard. That's considered a minimum standard. You can always do a little bit more, but I mean the object of an engineer is to try to meet all those applicable standards without over-designing things. Anybody can do that, and definitely without under-designing them. But a few years down the road, and you get a little bit of corrosion, you get a little bit of deterioration. Already you're at this level now, just as soon as you get any of that, and if it's been designed, you know, basically right to the limit, you're already below what the codes and standards have said. We deem this is the level of safety to reach. But I mean, most engineers wouldn't declare that building as, well, now it's suddenly unsafe, until it reaches some other level. What level? That's not defined. That's judgment. Maybe it's not good judgment sometimes. Because in terms of the inquiry heard from all the different engineers that were involved and set foot on this Algo Centre Mall over the years, you know, do you understand as an engineer that you have a duty to report? And all of them were quizzed on that, and all of them said, I totally understand my duty to report. If I have an issue, I need to report it. But all of them testified, in my judgment, what I saw, it hadn't reached that level, whatever that is. But that level's not defined, and it's not easy to define either. There is some guidance, but I don't think most engineers in structural necessarily avail themselves of it. But it's a complicated question, and certainly as a profession, I think it's something that we need to figure out, because particularly in terms of assessment of existing buildings, the legislation's all about new structures and nothing about maintaining what we've got particularly.
I'll just put a plug in here for the next OCEPP seminar. We are planning an OCEPP seminar on duty to report issues. We need to define a policy that will drive our guidance or regulation on duty to report. And so we want to have a workshop on duty to report. It's a very nebulous term. Every engineer knows they have a duty to report, but as Chris pointed out, when do you report? Who do you report to? I mean, these engineers who work in structural probably know all about the building code, but they don't know the Ministry of Labor regulations and how they could have used them to make some report. So hopefully we can investigate that issue in this coming seminar and try to get a little bit more handle on what that means to have a duty to report. Ishwar?
Yeah. Good question from Vic on the risk management. I want to focus on the specialties. You mentioned this issue has been discussed at the PEO Council also. How many specialties we will have? What are your thoughts? Like how many specialties? And how are you going to govern them as a profession in terms of regulation? Because no specialty is good unless you can manage it, regulate it, enforce it, and punish it if it's wrong. And second, you touched on inspection. It's not regulated. And there's so many inspectors in the city going around, and their quality of work goes from 0 to or 1 to 10, and you can't figure out. And they have beautiful offices, and the guy who has more money and can put up a good show, people go to him because he puts out a good report. And you can't see anything under the finishes. So I'm sort of narrowing down to this fact: the knowledge, experience, the skills. How will we develop for the specialist in years to come? And PEO has a lot of work to do on this. So how would you manage it, the specialty work? That's my big concern.
Okay, the first question that you asked is how many specialties would we have? Coming out of the Elliot Lake Inquiry, 1. Could there be others? It could be a model. I don't know. But first and foremost, in terms of because we were dealing specifically with this particular inquiry and the events. And to draw a little bit from another inquiry that happened back in 1988 after a collapse of a Save-On-Food store in Burnaby, British Columbia. There was an inquiry into that. In a different circumstance, this wasn't deterioration of building or anything like that. But there were a few lessons that could be learned from the findings of that inquiry in the final report. And they said that, first of all, in terms of the structural engineering aspects in that particular case, basic licensure as a professional engineer was not enough for the particularly specialized and highly risky field of structural engineering. And I'm quoting that. I didn't know you were going to ask that question, but I got the quote here for you. The other thing they said, and I'll quote, that structural engineers must have academic and practical qualifications beyond those required for registration as a professional engineer. The Elliot Lake Inquiry specifically heard during their testimony that structural assessments of this type, they require specialized knowledge. So that's what's kind of driving the motivation that I think that we need to respond to that. And if we don't respond to that, we run the risk of the public losing confidence in our ability to regulate and govern ourselves. This is a privilege that we have. It's not a right. And so in terms of the specialties, and talk more generally, maybe beyond just the Elliot Lake and this structural engineering specialties, I would resist the urge to make a specialty for every nice little pigeonhole of engineering practice that we have out there. We're about regulating the profession in the public interest. So if we identify a particular area or field where there's a particular risk, where we feel, or there's evidence to suggest, that somewhat more specialized knowledge above and beyond that required for your basic licensure to receive a professional engineering license, is required in order to protect the public. Or if there's a public expectation that they need to know that this individual has a particular skill set, it needs to be demonstrable and it needs to be current. Those are the areas that I think that we have not just an opportunity but a responsibility to ensure that we have practitioners that meet those requirements. As the regulator, Professional Engineers Ontario is essentially in, for the benefit of the public, the quality assurance business. One of the questions that was asked to us during the roundtables is, should there be a responsibility for individual engineers when they're taking on an assignment to declare to their client or prospective client their level of knowledge? Well, we saw that as first of all, like, it's just not going to work. And most engineers that I know, pretty good, they can pretty well figure out anything if they had to. And they're, for the most part, pretty good at it. But we can't expect, and my argument is, we can't expect the public to be able to make the determination as to the level of knowledge and whether that's sufficient for a particular engineering task. The public, that's our job to do. And by using these specialist certifications seems to me to be a reasonable vehicle to do it. We could do something different and say, well, we've got all kinds of different engineering and all different levels of risk to the public, and we're just going to make it raise the bar for all of them. We may be wasting a lot of resources in areas where it's not the target, where we have a problem that needs to be fixed. And the specialist designations and certifications give us that ability to be far more focused in what we do. In terms of inspections, that was another thing that came out of the inquiry in talking about the level of knowledge and so on. There was some talk about maybe things need to be more prescribed as to what you need to look at and how much you need to sample and so on and so forth. And my view on that and what we presented to the roundtables is, you know, every structure is different. I mean, they talked about should all parking structures be looked at, or should all this structure should be looked at, and so on. And I, you know, part of that is if you start making shopping lists and checklists and so on, you're never going to cover everything. You're not going to be able to anticipate all the different circumstances. So instead of doing that, I mean, that all comes down to engineering, experience, and judgment. So a far better approach is to make sure that we have experienced practitioners who can exercise the good judgment to decide on the number of samples and where they need to look for each different situation that they encounter. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I took a lot of time doing it, so hopefully you got some out of it.
Okay. I'm not going to argue against specialists, but...
you better not. I'll kick you.
I know. But I just want to point out some of the policy problems that we have in going forward from there. First of all, what is a specialist? Is it something on top of a license? So do you have the license all the way across that allows engineers to do everything and then have a specialist that can identify themselves as such? Or do you start saying, nope, that's a restricted area of practice, and other licenses suddenly get a chunk pulled out of them, so they're restricted, and everybody else, we introduce structural engineering specialists, now everybody else's license means all engineering except this. And if you do that, how do you do it? How do you suddenly put restrictions on people's licenses? The only way we have legally in the Act to put restrictions on other people's licenses is through discipline. So we end up saying, how does a person who's got a license that allows them to practice professional engineering suddenly get a restriction on? So we're just, the questions that have to get answered in introducing any of these recommendations that come up become quite complex and quite involved, and it's going to take a lot of engagement with a lot of different engineers and the public to know exactly what they're looking for in terms of a specialist. Do they just want somebody who's identified as a specialist? Then the people could get a specialist from the Canadian Institute of Steel Construction, for instance, as a steel construction expert, by having a certificate from there, just the same as your doctor has a certificate on the wall saying that they took a course in something in plastic surgery or something like that. It's not their license, but it's the fact that they have a certificate from a training institute. So, you know, we have to find out exactly what the public's looking for, how to go about this and how it fits into the regulatory regime we have now, or do we have to change our regulatory regime? Do we have to make sure that every engineer has a license that only allows that engineer to do specific work? That could be the approach. It's a matter of how we want to go about the whole process. But it takes looking at everything and not just throwing on a fix on top of something.
That's the fun of policy, right?
Yeah,
That's why we're here.
That's why it keeps us working.
Hi, my name is Ping Wu.
Hi,
I'm
Ping.
the president of Professional Engineers, Government of Ontario. So in short, we're PEGO.
Yes.
We're the association that represents 550 professional engineers and land surveyors who are employees for the Government of Ontario. I'm also a part-time faculty at the University of Guelph too. So I want to tell you that we do have a course in health and safety for our first-year program. You can check with Bob Doney and Jenna Levison. I'm sure they will confirm that. But my biggest problem as being a public servant and also the president of the association that represents all the engineers working for the province is, well, what is engineering? How do we define engineering? Like, for example, the long-term energy plan that Warren presented today. Ministry of Energy doesn't even have a single engineering position, not a single engineer working there. How do we ensure that public policy are being looked at from an engineering point of view? And Warren, you owe me $5 because when you talk about biomass, you didn't talk about biogas. So someone did not feed you the right information. And biogas comes from manure, right? Shit in, you know, whatever comes up. So, Bernie, you and I had this discussion way back, you know, about what's engineering. How come people are doing engineering work? We have about 50,000 employees, you know, working for the Government of Ontario. Only about 500 of us are engineers, okay? We have people in policy position who may be PEngers, but they are not doing engineering work, okay? So they are using the skills, the knowledge, and also things that they learned from school, like engineering principles, and they're applying it. But that we don't have people who can actually sign and seal reports as PEngers. And so please define what is engineering.
Engineering is defined in the Act. I mean,
But that doesn't help us.
I'm not sure why it wouldn't. I mean, it would take, I guess, our enforcement group to go out and investigate the situations, the people that are doing this work, and see if they're actually practicing engineering. I mean, a lot of people are influenced or are doing work that impacts on engineering structure. For instance, they're setting transit policy, but that doesn't mean they're designing roads and rail lines, so they're not doing the engineering work. So.
But we do have an image problem, okay? For example, if you watch HGTV, you watch Mike Combs, he got a problem with a house, he'll call in a structural engineer.
Yeah.
He got a problem with wiring, he called an electrician. So why is the electrician not an electrical engineer coming in to look at the electrical system of a house? But then when there's a structural problem, it's a structural engineer.
Okay. Well, I could go into the details of why that's so, because that's the building code and the Electrical Safety Act, because a building like that is specifically exempted from our act, except where there's an issue of structure that's outside the Part 9 of the building code, but that's getting into technical issues. And but that's what our enforcement group is there to do, to find out whether somebody is practicing engineering and isn't a licensed engineer.
Right. I guess my biggest problem is not people who are not trained engineers who are, you know, forging the PEngers. It's more about PEngers doing doing non-engineering type of work or not. Well, sorry, PEngers doing engineering type of work not being recognized. Okay, and also the government not recognizing the values of engineers, and they are not really defining what is engineering, or we're not clearly defining what's engineering for them.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
I'm not sure that's something we can help with. I mean, that's a good advocacy position for OSPI to deal with, for PEGO to deal with, to certainly to make sure that engineers are recognized for the work they provide in government. I must say that one of the problems is because the way our act is, our regulation for sealing is structured, you don't need to seal your work if you're not providing it to somebody outside the organization. I would like to see that changed, and I've drafted regulations to change that, but and therefore all engineering work would need to be sealed, whether it was done inside an organization or is provided to the outside world, but those regulations haven't gone through yet. So, any other questions? Oh, Jordan?
My question is a little more on the macro scale, and whether this provides an opportunity to at least examine a broader question, which is engineers are typically limited to the design phase of a structure project, et cetera. And obviously the expectation is others have responsibilities to follow through, the building inspectors, to ensure it's actually been carried out as designed. And you can take it that much further through the life cycle of the entire structure, process, product, whatever it happens to be. Is this an opportunity to perhaps step back and have a think about whether the role of the engineer should actually extend beyond the design phase, or are we content with allowing building officials and others to be fully responsible for those things? And if we're already moving, as recommended, into further inspections, investigations, are we not already sort of buying into whatever flaws may have occurred between the design, during the actual construction phase itself, and obviously maintenance that goes beyond?
Okay, in the case of Elliot Lake, it wasn't so much a design flaw. I mean, it's flawed in that they should have put a waterproofing membrane on it and such. But your question sounded more along the lines of you know, as the structural engineer on a project, I am responsible and I bear full responsibility for the adequacy and of my design. And I take that design, I do all my engineering, I put it on paper, and then it goes to the next party, who's a contractor, to actually carry out the design. And one of the difficulties when a problem arises when what they build doesn't match what I designed, whose responsibility is that, you know? And so there's lots of blame goes out there. The building officials get blamed because they didn't spot it. I am the structural engineer, I get blamed because I should have caught it. And, you know, and at the end of a project, even if things don't come up, the building departments want a letter from me saying that the design, the construction was all done right, you know. And it's like, well, first of all, there's a misunderstanding in the roles and responsibilities out there. Though, as a structural engineer, and the building code has in it that work performed, designs performed by an engineer need to be reviewed by an engineer under the building code. It doesn't have to be the same engineer, but regardless. But that review, and PEO in regulation, we have a standard for that. And it's a random, rational sampling, because you're not there on site, you're not paid to be there on site. And it's not intended to relieve the contractor of his or her responsibilities, because their responsibility under the contract is follow those plans that I did. My responsibility is make sure the plans are right. And my review is really just a sampling to see if they're understanding the intent of my design, in case something fell between the cracks. And so, you know, one of I would not want to see engineers put into the difficult situation where they're expected to take responsibility for things that are not within their care, custody, and control. They really should be within the contractor's care, custody, control. But maybe the contractor should step up to the plate and be professionals and taking professional responsibility for what they do. But that's a whole other public policy decision, and the government almost tried to go down that road at one point, but the contractors fought their way out of it. So I'm not sure if I've really answered your question, but that's kind of, you know, the landscape that's out there. It's very gray, because I do get that from building officials saying, I need you to sign off that everything's okay. And I say, I can't sign off, and it's not my role to sign off, and my insurance company would kill me for signing off on it, because there's also the insurance company saying, do not take responsibility for something that, or take on a risk that you're not being compensated to take on. So there's that whole aspect that gets into it as well. But there's mass confusion, and the municipalities, they're doing it because they want to avoid liability, because the first thing you hear out of the building officials is, anything goes wrong, we're always named in the lawsuit that we should have caught it. I'm a firm believer in we really need to have it much clearer as to the lines of responsibility and who's responsibility for what. But that's a bit of a pipe dream, because if anything does go wrong, everybody gets sued.
There's basically a whole social policy in place here about ownership, and the fact that ownership gives you freedom. You own a car, there's nothing that says that you have to maintain your car, other than, make sure you got your brake lights on or something like that, but nobody tells you to no law to get the oil put in the car, to check your brakes every so often. If you own land, you can pollute the land all you want. The only issue comes up when you want to sell it. Then you got to make sure that the person who's buying the land is aware that you polluted the land. You don't have to maintain your home. You can let the windows crack and pay all your heating bills as a result, but nobody's going to force you to do that. So in society, we have a certain amount of freedom as owners, and that's what we're running into here. Once the engineer designs something, then it becomes the owner's property, and the owner can do whatever they want with it. And I think if we're going to deal with those kind of issues, of course, the mall came under some other areas. It was a workplace, and the Occupational Health and Safety Act impacted on it, and I don't know why that doesn't become such a big issue. Building inspectors, engineers, everybody was looked at it, but the owner had a workplace that the owner was expected to maintain as a workplace, and so there are laws around workplaces, but if it was just property, if you built a building and didn't want to maintain it, I don't know what we could do about it unless we change some fundamental ideas in society about ownership.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to look within the organization, within the PEO. Where is the PEO now on continuing education? Because it seems to me that we graduate people from school in Canada. We have a lot of engineers who come over and get licensed. They've been educated in other jurisdictions. But in many respects, irrespective of their age, irrespective of their experience, we somehow expect everybody to behave the same. We need somehow a professional continuing education program. In other professions, every year you must, to maintain your certification, you must complete a certain amount of hours. I'm wondering if this whole issue that we're talking about here, the constant recognition of a duty to care, the constant reminder that if you're looking at a building and you're told just to look at the mildew, you really should think about the presence of water, the presence of humidity. Could that sort of thing be reinforced by us having to go through continuing education, not so much technical continuing education, but continuing education around engineering law, around what our responsibilities are, what our responsibilities to the society is. And then we can also have another level, because technology does emerge. Back in, I'm dating myself, but back in '92, I mean, one of the most significant arguments of my career was with some guy in Ottawa who was using an engineering document from 1938 to justify a design. And he thought he was perfectly all right. So that's the question I'm asking. Where is the PEO on continuing education? Is it of the opinion that continuing education would have helped here? And if so, what are the plans?
Okay, I'll take a stab at this one. A couple of things with continuing education. First of all, PEO Council did in November of just this past year, did unanimously pass a motion, and it was in response to a report that actually the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers had provided, advocating that we implement a continuing professional development system. They looked at other models, some of the other regulators like in Alberta. And so PEO Council did unanimously approve that we strike a task force with the aim that we would move towards some form of continuing professional development or whatever. Council recognized that something needs to be done. There'll be a lot of debate on the details, you can be certain. And so that's about as far as I can take you on Council's position on it. What we, from the Elliot Lake Inquiry, the question certainly came up in terms of, and that was one of the questions that they asked and brought up is, you know, how do we ensure that people doing this sort of work know what they're doing and stay up to date with changes? Because what was acceptable to do back when the mall was built in 1979 are very different than what's acceptable to do today, for example. And so, you know, in the recommendations that we came up with for the Elliot Lake Inquiry, part of that specialist certification would include knowledge assurance and continuing development, that sort of thing. Details not at all worked out because obviously at this point it's just a recommendation. That raises the bigger question, and one of the things that has always challenged us as the profession, as diverse in terms of what we do, as diverse in terms of who we do it for, and as that is a challenge that some of the other professions don't have. You know, for instance, our friends at the other table, the architects are far more focused in the type of work that all of their license holders do. They still have their challenges, I'm sure they'll tell you. But when you're dealing with engineering, where you're dealing from everybody from somebody designing a building structure to somebody designing in General Motors or somebody working on a nuclear plant or what have you, there are different risks, there are different demands. And the way that many of the other engineering regulators across the province have responded, some of them do have, many of them do have continuing professional development type programs in place, most voluntary, a couple mandatory. They've fallen into, in my humble opinion, a little bit of a trap in that, and most of them work on points, and you get points for practice and points for this and points for that, and you have to have a total number of points at the end. And certainly doing that is better than not doing anything at all. But the concern is, are you really getting, you know, is it window dressing? Is it to say, well, we have something, we're doing something? Or is it focused and targeted? Like some of what you were mentioning in your question was talking about, well, we want to make sure that engineers know some of this stuff, and that's kind of targeted. And I think that that's a reasonable approach. But of course, the targets are going to change depending on the discipline. Do some areas of practice, there probably isn't a need because there are so many market demands for keeping up with the changes and so on that the engineers practicing in that pretty much they've got to, or they're just not going to survive. There are other areas like mine in structural engineering where you would think that there would be that sort of pressure. There's a lot of pressure for just an engineer that just rubber stamps things and stays out of the way, because keeping up with technology sometimes costs more money in the designs. That's sort of a challenge. So it's a big challenge. I think that PEO Council is committed to dealing with it, but I could not predict at this point the form that it's going to take. And is it going to be just a one big system that everybody subscribes to? Is it only going to affect practicing engineers? Because we have many, 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 many license holders. We've got 80,000 license holders in Ontario, but a small subset actually practice or in areas of professional engineering where the public safety and welfare is affected. So do we focus on them? Do we do something for everybody? If we do it for everybody, does it water everything down? Lots of big questions. Those are policy questions. Yeah. That's why we're here today.
And I can go on from there. Council did approve the creation of a continuing professional development, competency, and quality assurance task force. Yes, we want to, that's their #1 task, to find a better acronym. They're
That'll take 3 or 4 meetings.
yeah, well, the task force terms of reference were prepared, and they cover a lot of the stuff that Chris talked about, that the group has to look at best practices. They have to figure out how this will play for all different types of engineers. That's why the committee task force will have 10 engineers in different, chosen from different areas, such as non-practicing, retired, working for a consulting firm, working in industry, working for government. Anyways, you can see the terms of reference. In fact, you all probably received an email asking you to participate on the, if you were interested in participating on the task force. We did receive 70 applications, and I understand that that has now been a selection is being made out of those 70, and the task force will be formed very soon. It is supposed to prepare a report by December 2015. You can check the terms of reference to see how much effort we want the committee, the task force, to go through in making a recommendation on the form of continuing professional development, because PEO has had numerous reports on CPD, several committees that looked at it in the past, various attempts at trying to put in place some program, and we're still at zero with nothing, no continuing professional development, because it is a complex issue made up of the fact that engineers span so many different occupations, practice engineering or don't practice engineering in many different ways, continue to hold their license, which gives them the right to practice engineering even though they might not have done any engineering for 30 or 40 years. So we have a lot of different issues to consider in putting in place a CPD program, and that's why it's failed in the past. So anyways, we'll keep you informed, and if you're interested in the terms of reference, I think they're should be still available on the PEO website in the call for volunteers section. But if you can't find them, give me a call, and if you want to look through the terms of reference, let me know and I'll send you a copy.
I think we're down to our last question. Michael?
Yeah, Mike Mastro, Mateo again, Engineering Dimensions. After the inquiry got started, a lot of us were hearing about things like engineer of record or creating a provincial chief engineer office. I'm just wondering if you think that would have made any difference as far as prevention is concerned, or would it have this been another area that would have not noticed anything, if you know what I mean? Like, it's because it was a existing structure that failed, it wouldn't have mattered if there was some kind of engineering oversight office that could have been on top of this case?
Sure, I'd be happy to comment on that. First of all, and I think you kind of half provided my answer back to me that I was going to give you. The concept of an engineer of record, which is a concept that's out there, and in some jurisdictions it's actually in the regulations and so on. But those are issues dealing with what would happen during the design phase, really. It's not about existing buildings and deterioration of existing buildings. And the engineer of record, well, I won't get into a long discussion of that, but what I will say is it was interesting in that during the roundtable sessions, this was put on by the Commission Inquiry, where they gather together the various parties and experts and so on. And it's the Commission that then has a series of questions that they want answers to. And they're useful from our standpoint because we can kind of see, well, what is resonating with the Commission? What are things that they're grappling with that they're seeking some additional input on? And one of the first questions, which if I ran through my long version of my presentation I would have showed you, was should there be a prime consultant? Should that find its way into legislation, building code, or something like that? Which is not the same as engineer of record, though its concept is there's somebody that is taking over, like looking at the big picture of the whole project and coordinating it and making sure things don't fall through the cracks, which engineer of record does that to a certain extent too, though on a discipline-specific basis. So our PEO's response to that particular question was, well, that's a little outside of our regulatory in terms of governing the practice of engineering. So we're not, PEO Council's never come up with a position on that aspect. But what we would be certainly supportive of is anything that does help to eliminate those gaps that we see, and so more coordination in the building industry is certainly something that we would welcome. So that's as far as that particular item. The other item is the concept of the provincial engineer, and that was also a question that came up at the roundtable, and that was an idea that was kind of floated very soon after the collapse, and I think it was our PEO president at the time actually approached the Premier's office and talked about, maybe there should be this provincial engineer. And though council never really, had a discussion about what our vision of that would be, it would be outside of PEO anyway. And so I perhaps can't articulate it as well as the past president, his vision was. But I suppose it would be akin to something like the medical officer of health or something like that, that sort of concept where it's an independent body. And perhaps in situations like Elliot Lake or deteriorating infrastructure or Gardner Expressways or things like that, perhaps it would be an office that would provide some more big picture examination of policy impacts on society that affect engineering and where there might be gaps there. Maybe the provincial engineer would do studies and comment on the declining resources in government ministries in terms of engineering oversight, like Ministry of Labor and things like that, that used to have a much broader role in inspection, and now with limited resources, that's one area that might have gotten cut. I'm just using that as a hypothetical example, and what the implications to the public may be of making those decisions. So looking at the engineering implications and such. So it's an interesting concept. It's one that maybe it would have had an impact because, as we found out from the inquiry, there's nothing out there on maintaining private buildings, and there's no motivation. And perhaps that's something that an office like that would take on, because at the present time,